Both of them fell on the bed, the sound of rain outside still falling, non-stop. John no longer held back any more. He felt every delicate line on Mrs. Ivy's body, every quick breath of hers, and knew that they were completely immersed in the vortex of desire. His hands gently on her body. Every touch, every caress contained a long-suppressed desire. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our channel, where we will bring the most interesting and dramatic stories in life. It will take the audience from one surprise to another. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any episodes. If you love Jane, you can go to the playlist to find Jane's other channels. In today's video, we will bring to you the audience the story, Wedding Night with Mother-in-Law. Please follow along. John is a young, dynamic and intelligent man who is in his final year of university, majoring in engineering with a promising future ahead. On the outside, he is calm, elegant, always tries to do everything well, and is quite discreet in love affairs throughout his student years. John focused on studying and building his future career, but then love came to him naturally and unexpectedly. Hayes is the girl who made John's heart flutter. She studied at the same school but majored in a different field. Hayes has a gentle appearance with bright eyes, long hair, and a smile that always contains gentleness and femininity. Their love blossomed from a chance meeting at the school library, and then everything between them developed slowly but firmly. John always cherished every moment with Hayes, and Hayes also gave him absolute trust. After more than a year of dating, John and Hayes's relationship was serious enough to think about introducing her to his family. For John, that meant entering a new phase in his life. Hayes intended to John drove home to meet his parents, which created both excitement and anxiety because he wanted to make a good impression on the family of the person he loved, especially Hayes's mother, Mrs. Ivy. Hayes's house was located in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by lush green gardens. John drove to Hayes's house on a weekend afternoon. It was a large, classic house with wooden doors and a balcony full of flowers. John couldn't hide his excitement as he prepared to enter the private space of the person he loved. Mrs. Ivy, Hayes's mother, was the first person John saw when he entered the house. She was a middle-aged woman, but still retained the salty beauty of youth. Her shiny black hair was neatly tied behind her back. Her face was bright with a gentle smile. What caught people's attention most was the youthfulness and elegance in her appearance. Mrs. Ivy was not only beautiful in the way of a middle-aged woman, but also exuded an unusual charm. "Hello, is it John? I heard Hayes mention you a lot." Mrs. Ivy's gentle voice rang out, her eyes looking at John with a warm but deep gaze. "Yes, hello, Mom," John replied with a smile, trying to stay confident in front of her attention. It was undeniable that from the very first moment, John felt a strange attraction from Mrs. Ivy. The gentleness in her gestures and her soft voice made John's heart beat faster, even though he told himself that he should only focus on Hayes, but Mrs. Ivy's attraction was always present in every moment of contact during the first dinner at Hayes's house. John had the opportunity to get closer to Mrs. Ivy. There were only 2 mothers and children left in the house. Hayes's father had passed away more than 4 years ago. The conversation was quite comfortable and cozy, but John couldn't help but pay attention to every gesture of Mrs. Ivy. She often asked and took care of John in a very natural way, but was also subtle enough to not make things too special every time she gently spoke. John felt his heart flutter. Since the first meeting at Hayes's house, John felt a change in his heart every time he entered that house. Besides his increasingly strong feelings for Hayes, there was a strange feeling of emotion creeping into him, which was an inexplicable attraction from Mrs. Ivy, Hayes's mother. Every time he came to the house, John not only felt the warmth of the familiar space, but was also attracted by a graceful, delicate, and equally charming beauty from Mrs. Ivy. Mrs. Ivy was no longer young, but that only increased her attractiveness. John didn't know when, but her eyes made him feel a strange attraction, a feeling that he had never experienced before. In the mornings when he came to Hayes's house, Mrs. Ivy was usually still preparing breakfast in the kitchen. Hayes sometimes hadn't woken up yet, and John sat in the living room, listening to Mrs. Ivy working quickly. Every step she took was gentle, creating the feeling that everything in the house was carefully taken care of by her. Once John saw Mrs. Ivy hanging clothes in the yard. The shirt she wore was tight on her body when the wind blew, revealing her soft curves. Mrs. Ivy reached for each item of clothing from the clothesline. Each movement was very natural, but exuded a proud, noble beauty when John stepped out into the yard. Mrs. Ivy turned around. Her smile seemed to melt all the shyness in his heart. "You came so early. Hayes probably hasn't woken up yet. Come in and sit down," Mrs. Ivy said. Her voice was gentle. Her loving sound seemed to lull John's heart. "No, it's okay, I can wait," John replied, but his eyes still swept over her every gesture, every step, every movement of Mrs. Ivy, making his heart strangely moved. Mrs. Ivy continued her work, walking lightly through the garden with soft slippers, her hair gently swaying with each step. John couldn't deny that Mrs. Ivy exuded an indescribable beauty, even in ordinary jobs like this, not needing money or intentionally seducing. It was her naturalness. That's what made her special in John's eyes. Every time John and Hayes sat with Mrs. Ivy in the living room, he always noticed a gentle care from her. She didn't talk much, but every gesture and every look was very delicate. One afternoon when John came to Hayes's house, Hayes was in the office while John sat downstairs with Mrs. Ivy. She was enjoying tea. Her slender hands gently took the tea and gave it to John. The morning and afternoon tea came through the window and gently touched her face, creating a perfect scene. "Mum makes such fragrant tea," John said, trying to stay calm under Mrs. Ivy's eyes. "Mum isn't good at much. She just knows how to take care of the family." Mrs. Ivy smiled softly. Her voice was both humble and gentle. Every word and gesture of Mrs. Ivy brought a natural beauty. She didn't seduce anyone, but it was that simplicity that made John unable to hold back, the way she struggled to try the tea, or the accidental touch when giving tea to John. All left deep impressions on him. John began to realize that he not only admired Mrs. Ivy as Hayes's mother, but also felt a real attraction to her, a charm that was both seductive and powerful. One evening when John was home having dinner with the Hayes family, he realized that the smallest moments in life also highlighted Mrs. Ivy's charm. During the meal, Mrs. Ivy always paid attention to taking care of everyone, from the way she picked up food for John to the way she talked gently with Hayes and himself. Every time she talked, her eyes gently lit up. Her gaze seemed to contain something deep that John could not fully understand. "Eat more, you look thinner." Mrs. Ivy smiled lightly as she put more food in John's bowl. John could only smile back, but his heart could not leave the emotion. He felt that every small action of hers, even simple tasks like taking care of meals, contained a hidden power. Sometimes her eyes looked at him silently, stopping for a few seconds longer than usual, making John feel like there was something very special between the two of them. This feeling did not come from Mrs. Ivy's effort, but from the naturalness in each of her gestures. Every time she smiled lightly, every time she touched John's shoulder when passing by, his heart beat faster. John began to realize that he was attracted to her, an attraction that came from unintentional but powerful moments in everyday life. Gradually, John realized that everything about Mrs. Ivy attracted him in an unexpected way. From the way she took care of the flowers in the garden, dried the clothes in the sun, to the way she fanned herself whenever she saw John entering the house. Such simple tasks in life, when done by Mrs. Ivy, became strangely attractive. There were times when John felt his heart in turmoil when sitting across from Mrs. Ivy in the living room. She sat reading a book, her hands gently turning each page, her eyes attentive, but still shining with stillness. Every time she gently passed John, a slight smile appeared, and John could not resist her charm. Every moment, every look, every smile of Mrs. Ivy left John with indescribable emotions. He knew that he had gone too far, but could not stop. It was her charm in her daily life that made him crave Mrs. Ivy more than ever. As time passed, John's feelings for Mrs. Ivy seemed to be out of control. Every time he went to Hayes's house, he not only wanted to see his lover, but also secretly wanted to see Mrs. Ivy, to be closer to her. It seemed like an invisible attraction from her had taken over his mind, making his every thought more and more filled with her image in the most ordinary moments. There were times when John tried to tell himself that this feeling was wrong, that he shouldn't think so much about Hayes's mother. But the more he tried, the deeper he found himself sinking into tense emotions. Mrs. Ivy was not only a gentle mother, but also exuded a natural charm that made John unable to take his eyes off her. One Sunday morning, John arrived at Hayes's house early. He didn't expect anything more than to enjoy the family atmosphere as he usually did. But as soon as he entered the house, the image of Mrs. Ivy in the garden made him stop. She was wearing a simple dress. Her long hair was tied loosely behind her neck, gently blowing in the breeze. She was taking care of the flowers in the small garden. Her every gesture was gentle, as if the whole world around her revolved around the peace she brought. John paused and looked at her from afar. There was something in the way she took care of the plants that made John feel like he couldn't take his eyes off. The stillness in each action, the way she meticulously pruned each branch and leaf as if she was cherishing the most beautiful things in nature. All of it made John attracted. He felt like he was being pulled by an irresistible force, a feeling not only of admiration but also of a stronger desire. "Come in, Hayes is definitely awake," Mrs. Ivy said, her voice ringing softly in the peaceful space of the morning. John was startled out of his thoughts. He walked into the house at her invitation, but his mind kept repeating the image of her in the garden. Mrs. Ivy continued to walk into the kitchen to prepare breakfast for the whole family. The sounds coming from the kitchen, the sound of knives cutting vegetables, the gentle sound of dishes clattering created a warm but also charming family atmosphere. Mrs. Ivy did not need to do anything special. Her charm came from the most ordinary things. Every time he visited Hayes's house, John couldn't help but watch Mrs. Ivy's every move. Another time when John came to visit, Hayes was busy upstairs, and he sat with Mrs. Ivy in the living room. She was reading a book, her eyes focused on each page, her hands gently turning each page with familiar elegance. John sat opposite, but his eyes couldn't stop observing her. Every time she gently looked up, her eyes glanced over John. Her lips smiled slightly, then returned to the book. "Have some tea, I've made some new tea," Mrs. Ivy said softly. Her voice was gentle, like a sweet invitation. "Thank you, Mom," John replied, trying to keep his voice calm, but when Mrs. Ivy stood up to pour tea, her silk long-sleeved dress gently fluttered with each movement. Her hands were soft as she handed the tea to John, and that closeness made his heart beat faster. Mrs. Ivy sat down opposite John and took a small sip of tea. Her lips were rosy and her face was so graceful that John couldn't stop looking. Every action of hers, even the smallest things in daily life, made John feel attracted. He felt the delicacy and gentleness in every gesture and word of hers, and that made it harder and harder for him to keep his distance. The more he interacted with Mrs. Ivy, the more John felt the indescribable attraction she brought. She didn't appear to be intentionally seductive. but it was the naturalness and grace in every action that made him unable to take his eyes off her. One time, John and Mrs. Ivy sat together in the living room while Hayes was cooking. Mrs. Ivy sat on the chair with her legs crossed, her hand gently stroking her soft hair as she talked to him. "Mum is always so busy," John said softly, his eyes furtively looking at the small details on her face. "Mum is just used to doing housework. What's so busy about it?" Mrs. Ivy smiled softly, looking at John affectionately. John realized that her presence created a warm atmosphere in the house, but also made him uncomfortable. He tried to stay awake, but increasingly realized that he was being caught up in a bit of unresolved emotion. Every time Mrs. Ivy stood up to walk around or simply sat still next to John, he felt an indescribable excitement. That evening, John went to Hayes's house as usual to have dinner with his family. The atmosphere in the house was always warm, with laughter and cheerful chatter echoing around the dining table, and Hayes's mother, Ivy, still maintained her familiar gentleness, always taking care of each family member. However, in John's heart, there had long been a storm, a feeling of longing for Ivy that he did not dare to admit. When the meal ended, Hayes received a call from a friend who needed to meet her urgently. She hurried away and told John to stay and play with his mother and would return immediately after finishing work. John just nodded silently. His heart was a little confused. "Stay here, I'll be right back," Hayes said, putting on her raincoat and looking at John with trusting eyes. John nodded, but when the door closed, he knew that tonight's dinner would not be like every other time. He and Ivy, the woman he secretly longed for, were now the only two people left in the quiet house. "Mrs." Ivy continued to wash the dishes after the meal, not knowing that John's eyes were still furtively following her every move. Her long-sleeved silk dress fluttered slightly every time she bent down. Her slender, velvety demeanour always made John unable to take his eyes off her. All the emotions in his heart that had been suppressed for so long seemed to collapse. The sound of rain began to ring outside, each drop gently falling on the roof, creating a familiar melody. The sudden night rain seemed to make the atmosphere in the house even more stifling. John sat silently on the sofa, his eyes unable to leave Mrs. Ivy's figure. "It's raining again," Mrs. Ivy said softly, wiping her hands as she walked into the living room, sitting down on the chair opposite John. She looked out the window, her eyes absent-minded as if she was lost in thought. John nodded gently, but his heart was pounding. There were only two people in the house. It was quiet, and the sound of the rain falling outside was all like urging the emotions he was trying to suppress. "Do you want some tea, Mom? I'll make some for you." John tried to stay calm, his voice softly ringing out. Mrs. Ivy smiled and nodded. "Just sit still and let me make some." She stood up and walked into the kitchen. Her gentle and soft manner made John feel even more inexplicable emotions welling up in his heart. He couldn't stop following her every step. Everything about Mrs. Ivy, from the way she moved to the way she sighed softly as she looked out at the rain, made him long for something that he knew was wrong. When she returned with 2 cups of tea and sat down next to him, John clearly felt the closeness between the two of them. The sound of the rain outside was getting louder and louder, but in this small room the space became quiet with the emotions that both of them tried to hide. Mrs. Ivy placed the cup of tea in front of John. Her hands gently touched his hands unintentionally. The light touch was like a small fire kindling in John's heart. Mrs. Ivy's soft hands, warm skin, all made John feel his heart beat faster. "Mom!" John spoke softly, his voice choked. His eyes looked at Mrs. Ivy's eyes, and both of them seemed to understand that. Mrs. Ivy gently lowered her eyes, momentarily confused, but instead of leaving John, she just sat still, her eyes looking down at the cup of tea in her hand, as if trying to avoid her own emotions. The sound of the rain outside still rang out steadily, making the atmosphere between the two of them more tense than ever. "I can't stop any more," John whispered, his eyes filled with longing. Mrs. Ivy did not reply, but her eyes darkened in silent acceptance. John moved closer, his hands gently touched her shoulders. Mrs. Ivy did not push him away, but instead let his hands pull her closer. The long suppressed emotions filled the space, and John could no longer control himself. He bent down, his lips lightly touched her neck, feeling her soft and warm skin through the foundation. Mrs. Ivy gently closed her eyes. Her lips pursed slightly as if to comfort the emotions that were surging. "Mom," John whispered again. His hands gently pulled her into his embrace. Mrs. Ivy's eyes were still half closed for a moment, and she let John lead them into a wave of emotions that might not stop. In that small apartment, everything seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of them with their long suppressed desires. The rainy night outside was still heavy, creating a loud sound hitting the window as if to hide the tension that was enveloping the house. In the quiet space, only John and Mrs. Ivy remained, two people with long suppressed emotions standing before a threshold that they knew they would never return to. The distance between the two seemed to be stretched by tense emotions that could not be soothed. "Mum, come in with me," John whispered, holding Mrs. Ivy's hand, gently but skillfully, pulling her up and leading her to the bedroom. Each of their footsteps echoed in the silence, with only the sound of the rain outside as the only rhythm for this moment. The bedroom door closed, separating them from the outside world. In the dim light, John stood before Mrs. Ivy, his eyes unable to leave her. The light silk dress hugging her body created an attractive affection that John could not hold back. He knew he had gone too far, but the closeness in his heart did not allow him to stop. John's hands slowly moved gently to Mrs. Ivy's waist, pulling her closer to him. Her breathing was rapid, and her eyes showed a struggle, but there was no sign of resistance. All boundaries had changed, leaving only two people with tense emotions. John's hands gently caressed Mrs. Ivy's back and no longer held back any resistance. "Mom," John whispered again, his voice sweet but full of affection. Ivy spoke softly, and then she responded to him with a soft but meaningful kiss on the lips. John felt his heart melt as Ivy wrapped her arms around him as an acknowledgement that they could not go back. His hands trembled as he pulled her silk dress down, revealing her soft white skin. The light in the room fell on her body, creating a picturesque landscape. Ivy said nothing, but moaned softly under his touch, and her lips responded to his kisses with gentleness, but avoidance. The two of them fell onto the bed, the sound of the rain outside still falling incessantly. John no longer held back any more. He felt every delicate line on Mrs. Ivy's body, every rapid breath of hers, and knew that they were completely immersed in a whirlpool of desire. His hands were gentle on her body. Every touch, every caress contained a long suppressed desire. Mrs. Ivy also responded. Her hands caressed his face. Her breath was rapid and excited. John could feel her heartbeat speeding up, and he himself could no longer control his emotions. His lips moved all over her body. Each delicate kiss made both of them seem to be immersed in a storm of emotions. John's hands began to move more slowly and respectfully, each of his fingers gently following Mrs. Ivy's thin body. She shivered as his fingers touched every corner of her, as if his every touch was stirring up a fever of desire within her. Their lips never parted, each kiss becoming softer and deeper, and what was to come came. Both of them entwined with each rhythmic movement. They worked for over an hour before finally finishing. Finally, after the sublime and magical moments, both of them stopped. They lay next to each other, their breathing slowly settling down. John held Mrs. Ivy in his arms as if not wanting to let the moment pass. They were silent, but there was no need to say anything, because everything was done. The whole room was immersed in silence. Mrs. Ivy was in John's arms. Her breathing had returned to normal, but the warmth of the moment just past still lingered on both of their faces. John closed his eyes and looked up at the ceiling, his heart still lingering after what had just happened. But inside him a worry began to creep in, a feeling of slight unease about something. Mrs. Ivy gently stirred in John's arms, her eyes still ecstatic after the dream. She looked at him with a gentle smile. But her eyes also flashed a glimmer of awareness of reality. John knew that he couldn't stay here much longer. Mrs. Ivy's daughter Hayes could return at any moment. The thought made him restless, and the satisfaction was gradually replaced by a sense of urgency to leave before something undesirable happened in this house. "I have to go, Mom," John whispered, his voice soft but firm. Mrs. Ivy understood immediately, although she didn't want to. She knew he was right. They had crossed the line, and that meant that every action they took had to be more careful. He turned to look at Mrs. Ivy one more time before leaving, his eyes filled with worry. "Be careful, Mum," he pondered. Mrs. Ivy nodded, her lips slightly pursed, saying nothing, but her eyes said it all. John stepped forward, kissing her gently, then quickly walked towards the door. The sound of the door opening in the quiet house made a soft sound, but like a bell in John's heart. He walked out of the room, walking softly down the hallway, each step counted by seconds, not too fast, but enough so that he wouldn't attract attention. At this moment, his mind was only thinking about leaving the house without being discovered. As he reached the front door, John was startled by the noise outside. His heart stopped for a moment, and his hand gripped the doorknob. The iron gate rattled, and immediately John knew that Hayes was back. His heart clenched in fear, and his whole body froze. Hayes came back just as he was about to leave, unable to turn back. John quickly turned around and walked into the dark corner near the stairs, trying to keep himself out of Hayes's sight. He held his breath as he stood still in the darkness, listening to Hayes's footsteps as she entered the house. The front door creaked softly as Hayes opened it, and her footsteps echoed on the tiled floor. Hayes entered the house and stopped in the living room. John let out a relieved breath when she showed no sign of heading towards her mother's room. He thought about the front door, trying to figure out how to leave without being seen, but Hayes suddenly turned and walked quickly towards him. John panicked but still didn't dare to make a move. He could hear Hayes's footsteps getting closer and closer, echoing in the silence. He retreated deeper into the dark corner, trying to keep his breathing steady. Hayes walked up the stairs, but luckily she went straight to the upper floor without stopping. John watched carefully, realizing that he had just escaped danger. He stood still, waiting for Hayes's steady footsteps, then looked towards the door. As quick as lightning, John tiptoed to the main door. His hand gently turned the doorknob and opened it, without making any sound. He stepped outside and took a deep breath of the cool night air outside the quiet street, with only the gentle sound of the wind blowing. John turned his head to look back at the house one more time, before quickly walking away and disappearing into the darkness, leaving behind all the complicated feelings. Meanwhile, in the small apartment, Mrs. Ivy sat quietly on the bed listening to every little sound from outside. When the last door closed, she let out a soft sigh, but there was still an inexplicable void in her heart. She knew that things had gone too far and that this would never stop. The door to the room opened. Hayes walked in, her eyes curiously looking at her mother. "Are you still not asleep?" Mrs. Ivy smiled lightly, but there was still a bit of worry in her heart that could not be dispelled. "Yes, I'm getting ready to go to bed," she replied. "Has John been home for a long time, Mom?" Hayes asked her mother gently. Mrs. Ivy quickly replied, "He came back about 10 minutes after I went out." Hayes approached the bed, but did not realize the tension hidden under her mother's smile. "Then remember to go to bed early, Mom," she said, then turned and walked out and closed the door. The room returned to its usual silence, but Mrs. Ivy knew that tonight's peace was only a thin shell, and what emotions and consequences lay beneath that surface. After the night, John and Mrs. Ivy secretly met. His relationship with Hayes continued to develop. John tried to keep things natural between him and Hayes, and even invested more in building feelings for her to fill the feeling of insecurity. As the days passed, Hayes had no doubt that she still loved John with all her heart. The first time when their relationship really became serious was when Hayes asked John to come home to have dinner with her family more often. This made John feel uneasy because every time he set foot in Hayes's house, he had to face Mrs. Ivy, whom he was trying to avoid. However, not wanting to hurt Hayes or make her suspicious, John accepted the invitation. Every dinner at Hayes's house became a challenge for John. At the dinner table, Hayes always smiled, told happy stories, and shared their future plans. Mrs. Ivy, sitting next to him, always kept a calm face, but not distant. Sometimes she glanced at John with a meaningful look, as if she knew all his thoughts without having to say it. John always felt the tense atmosphere between him and Mrs. Ivy, but he tried not to show it. As time passed, Hayes and John gradually became closer. Hayes was always the one who took the initiative in planning their future. She often asked John about buying a house together, planning for marriage, and even about children. She looked at John with eyes full of trust, making John feel more responsible in this relationship, going out together more and more. As Hayes became closer to John, she began to share more about her inner thoughts and dreams. Hayes wanted a small family, a cozy home, and above all, she always hoped that John would be a loving husband, a good father that she could rely on. John listened to Hayes's confidences, felt her love growing, and in his heart, the thought of a wedding gradually formed. One evening, while drinking coffee at a familiar cafe of the two, Hayes looked at John with eyes filled with joy. She shyly took his hand. Her voice was gentle but full of anticipation. "What do you think about us going further?" Hayes asked, her eyes filled with hope. John looked at Hayes, and in that moment he realized that their relationship had come to a new stage. Hayes was someone he knew he could trust and love. Putting aside his tense feelings about Ivy, John decided he needed to dedicate himself to a future with Hayes. "I've thought about it too," John replied in a low but sincere voice. "I think we should get married. I want a future with you." John's words made Hayes glow. Her smile lit up like a light of happiness. From then on, Hayes began planning their wedding. She spent a lot of time researching restaurants, small details of the wedding, and even discussed with both families. The following days were the time they spent together more than ever. John and Hayes went to choose wedding rings together, looked for a venue, and made a guest list. During the afternoon walks together, the two often talked about the future after marriage, about the house they would build, about the good things they would share together. John was always quietly by her side, listening and agreeing with all her decisions. He understood that this was what he had to do. It was his responsibility to Hayes's love. As the wedding day approached, the atmosphere became tense. Both families were busy preparing for the big day. Every time he came to Hayes's house, John had to face Mrs. Ivy's eyes. Although she didn't say it, he knew that she still remembered very clearly what had happened between them. Finally, the wedding day of John and Hayes came, a day that Hayes had been waiting for with all the excitement and joy. From early morning, Hayes's house was bustling with laughter, preparation, and a joyful atmosphere. Hayes, in her pure white wedding dress, looked like a princess in the early morning sunlight. The thin veil covering her head gently made her more gorgeous and gentle. Hayes's face was radiant in the morning with an unconcealable smile, her eyes filled with happiness. The house was meticulously decorated everywhere, short chairs, a long red carpet from the gate leading to the middle of the living room where the wedding ceremony would officially take place. Relatives and friends from both families were present early. Everyone congratulated and was excited about the wedding of the young couple. Everyone admired the compatibility of John and Hayes. They looked at the two as a perfect couple, full of love and future. In a black suit, John stood waiting outside, his heart filled with mixed emotions. He saw Hayes coming out of her room in a beautiful and radiant white wedding dress. At this moment, John could not deny that Hayes was the girl he wanted to spend his life with, even though in his heart there was still a part of the memory that could not be ignored about Mrs. Ivy. When John led Hayes onto the stage, all eyes turned to her. Hayes walked with a bright smile, her eyes turned to John, the person she believed would bring her a happy life. They exchanged loving glances as if the world was theirs. The wedding took place solemnly and emotionally. When John held Hayes's hand and spoke, his voice was a little shaky, but still full of determination. "I promise to love you, protect you, and overcome all difficulties in life with you." John spoke slowly, but sincerely. Hayes looked at him with teary eyes. She said nothing, just blinked as a sweet agreement. When it was Hayes's turn, she held John's hand, small but strong, full of trust and love. "I promise to always be by your side, love you, and take care of you for the rest of my life," Hayes said, her voice soft but clear. John felt his heart filled with happiness when he heard Hayes's heartfelt words. It was the moment when they both knew that from now on they would embark on a new journey, a journey of connection and companionship. After completing the rituals, John and Hayes shared their first kiss as husband and wife. Applause rang out everywhere. The entire wedding hall exploded in joy and blessings from everyone. Laughter, congratulations, clinking glasses everywhere. John and Hayes's friends surrounded them and continuously sent them their best wishes. Their wedding became a big event, a day when everyone was happy. During the party, John and Hayes went around the tables to greet the guests and receive blessings from everyone. Hayes hugged John's hand tightly, her face full of smiles. John also tried to join in the joy, but deep inside he still couldn't escape the heavy feeling that haunted him every time he accidentally saw Mrs. Ivy sitting in the crowd. Her mysterious eyes made his heart confused. Mrs. Ivy didn't say anything, but that look was like a reminder that the secret between them was still hidden. The night finally fell. Everyone left one by one, leaving the wedding room in silence. Under the light and scent of flowers, John and Hayes entered their honeymoon room. The room was carefully decorated with rose petals scattered on the bed and flickering candles. Hayes, in her white wedding dress, was still as radiant as in the morning, sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes shining with happiness and hope for the future. She turned to John and held his hand. "We are finally husband and wife," Hayes said, her smile radiant. John sat down next to Hayes, looking at her with gentle eyes, but in his heart an indescribable feeling arose. Hayes was the person he loved, the person he had chosen to share his life with, but in John's mind, the images of Mrs. Ivy were still somewhere that could not be erased. That feeling clung to him like a dark secret that crept into every corner. In the peaceful and quiet space of the wedding night, John tried to clear all the confusing thoughts in his heart, but he knew that this was just the beginning of a complicated relationship that he did not know how to solve. As Hayes fell into a gentle sleep beside John, still lying there but his heart was restless, the images of Mrs. Ivy were still in his mind. John tried to be silent, trying to suppress those thoughts in his heart, but the more he suppressed them, the stronger they became. Finally, he couldn't bear it any more. Gently, like a wind, John got out of bed and walked quickly, trying not to make any noise. Hayes was still sleeping soundly, completely unaware. John walked out of the room, the door creaked as he gently opened it, John's heart pounding in his chest, both anxious and driven by a desire he couldn't resist. Walking down the stairs, the space around him was eerily quiet. Only the dim light through the window clearly illuminating the path John was walking forward. He was Mrs. Ivy's room door. For a brief second, but then as if caught in an uncontrollable whirlwind, he gently pushed the door open and entered. Inside, Mrs. Ivy was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking peaceful and gentle, but her eyes could not hide her anticipation. She was wearing a cream-coloured nightgown, the soft light of the nightlight shining on her face, highlighting her deep, meaningful eyes. "What are you doing here at this hour?" Mrs. Ivy spoke, her voice low as if hiding a deadlock. John was silent for a moment, his lips pressed tightly together, his eyes not leaving hers. Mrs. Ivy's question was like a warning, but instead of making him stop, it only made his desire surge. "You know why I'm here," John replied, his voice quiet but not hidden. Mrs. Ivy smiled, a seductive smile flashing across her lips. "You know this is wrong, right?" she asked, but her eyes sparkled with desire, as if inviting him to come closer. "I know," John replied hastily, his steps moving closer to the bed, feeling like each step pushed him closer to the brink of betrayal. "But I can't stop." Mrs. Ivy stood up and walked towards John, her eyes never leaving him. "Are you sure once you go forward, there is no turning back, Mrs.?" Ivy's words rang out like a final warning, but John couldn't stop. As she stepped forward, the distance between them gradually narrowed. Mrs. Ivy gently touched John's hand. Her eyes looked up with an inviting gaze. Without waiting any longer, John reached out to hug her and pulled her closer, her breath fanning lightly on his neck, their lips only a few centimeters apart. "Don't even think about going back," Mrs. Ivy whispered, her voice full of promise. Immediately, John could no longer control himself. He leaned down, his lips touching Mrs. Ivy's in a longing kiss. Mrs. Ivy responded to his kiss without any resistance. Her arms wrapped around his neck, pulling him closer, both of them caught in a whirlwind of desire that knew no boundaries. Their kiss became deeper and more possessive, as if all the emotions that had been suppressed for so long were released. Mrs. Ivy pulled John down on the bed, both of them immersed in the feeling of ecstasy. The steady breathing, the captivating touches echoed in the narrow space of the room. The feeling between them burned like an unquenchable fire. John had no thoughts other than Mrs. Ivy, only the sublime moments that were taking place. But in the midst of that ecstasy, a sudden noise rang out from the hallway. The sound of the bridal chamber door opening startled both of them, but before they could react, the door to Mrs. Ivy's room swung open. Hayes stood there, her eyes wide open in despair, her breathing ragged, her lips trembling as if she couldn't say a word. The scene before her eyes was too shocking. Her husband, the man she had just given her love and vows to, was making love with her mother on their wedding night. "What are you two doing?" Hayes struggled to ask, her voice breaking in shock and anger. Mom." She couldn't believe her eyes, feeling like the whole world was collapsing right before her eyes. John quickly removed his hand from Mrs. Ivy, his face pale. Mrs. Ivy sat up, her eyes blinking but not knowing what to do. She could only remain silent, not daring to face her daughter. Hayes stood there, her eyes filled with anger. She clenched her fists, her breaths in and out, as if she was trying to control the anger inside her. "Mom, do you think I will forgive this?" The room became suffocating. No one said anything. John lowered his head, knowing in his heart that everything was over. There was no excuse that could justify this situation. Mrs. Ivy let out a choked sob from her throat, but she knew she had ruined everything. Hayes smiled faintly, her eyes filled with determination. "Okay, everything is clear. John, from now on, we have nothing to do with each other. You are no longer the person I love, no longer my fiancé." Her voice was cold as ice. Every word she spoke contained hatred inside. And then deeply, "Go away." Hayes gritted her teeth and looked at John with emotionless eyes. "Get out of my life. Get out of this house and never come back. I don't want to see your face again." John was silent, not saying a word of explanation. He knew he had lost Hayes, and nothing could save this relationship. The feeling of regret welled up in her heart, but it was too late to change anything. Mrs. Ivy knelt down, her voice trembling. "Hayes, I'm sorry, I really don't know what to do. I was wrong. I don't deserve to be forgiven, but please forgive John. This is my fault." But Hayes shook her head, her voice firmer than ever. "Mum, this is my decision. John has to leave, and from now on I will never forgive either of you. I have lost faith and love." She turned around, leaving both John and Mrs. Ivy in the room filled with pain. John walked out of the house in a daze in the terrifying silence. He knew that everything was over, not only for Hayes, but his life from that moment on would never be the same again. Mrs. Ivy sat there, holding her face, feeling extremely guilty and lost. Hayes was no longer her daughter, and she knew that their relationship had been broken forever by this irreparable mistake. That night, Hayes was alone in her room with mixed emotions. She couldn't believe what she had just witnessed, couldn't accept that she and John, the person she once loved the most, had betrayed her in such a cruel way. Tears streamed down Hayes's face, but they were no longer tears of love or simple pain, but of broken trust, of emptiness that nothing could fill. The next day, John left the house that he thought would be his and Hayes's home. He left no greetings or explanations. Everything was clear. There was no reason to prolong it. He left in silence, carrying the pain of regret, knowing that he could never return, not only losing Hayes, but also losing himself. As for Mrs. Ivy, after John left, she seemed to have lost all her strength. She tried to find a way to talk to Hayes, but all her efforts were in vain. Hayes did not open her heart, did not respond to any pleas or apologies. Every time Mrs. Ivy tried to approach Hayes, she just turned away, leaving her alone. As time passed, the house became colder and colder. Hayes began to live alone to avoid having to face her mother. The relationship between mother and daughter became more distant. There were no more conversations or sharing like before. Betrayal created an invisible wall between them that could not be broken. No matter how hard Ivy tried, she could not regain her daughter's trust and love. She lived in a large house, but felt empty and lonely all the time. No one was by her side, no more happy laughter from her family. Only sadness and loneliness remained. She knew that she had lost everything. After leaving John and her mother, Hayes gradually became cold and secretive. She no longer believed in love or sincerity. The traces of betrayal were still deep in her heart. She threw herself into her work, trying to forget everything, but the memories of her mother and John kept clinging to her, not letting her forget. In the end, all three people's lives were ruined. John lived in regret and loneliness, always tormented by his mistakes. Hayes lost faith in humanity, and life always carried a wound that never healed. And Mrs. Ivy, the woman who once loved and cared for her daughter, now only had emptiness and guilt, living alone in a cold house. None of them were happy, none of them could go back to fix the mistakes they made. The tragedy happened, and now everyone has to suffer the consequences for the rest of their lives. Our story today will stop here. If you and your friends find this story interesting, don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment about your thoughts below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next interesting stories. each like, a share button, and a subscription from you and your friends will be the motivation to help Jane and the program production team create more interesting videos. And now I would like to say goodbye, see you in the next videos, wish you a wonderful day,